Welcome back to Block TV. I'm Ron Friedman, and it's time for CryptoGlobe. This is where we take a trip around the world to hear about the latest developments in the blockchain and cryptocurrency industry. To guide us on this tour, as usual, is Ethan Pierce. He's the director of the Paris-based Crypto Assets Institute, speaking to us today from Dayton, Ohio. Hi, Ethan. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing today?
Excellent. Price of Bitcoin and market, red market notwithstanding.
Time to buy. Time to buy. It's a Christmas sale.
There you go. There you go. All right, we're going to look at a bunch of stories this week. We want to start, though. Reports from the UN, and the UN Migration Agency is going to use blockchain technology to stamp out illegal fees charged to migrant workers in Hong Kong. Very specific. What do you know about this?
Yeah, so this is a great. People ask continually now as they start to hear about blockchain or crypto assets, or especially on the blockchain side, give us real examples that don't have anything to do with cryptocurrencies or why does the blockchain matter when other technologies, other database solutions or other things could potentially be used. And this is really a fantastic, I think, use case going forward to show how we can solve a very significant real world problem. So Hong Kong, about 10% of the workforce in Hong Kong are migrant domestic workers. Like 99% of those are women. And so I think it comes out to around 400,000 women work in domestic space, housekeeping, nannies, things like that. And the majority of those are from other countries and tend to, because of language issues, documentation issues, all kinds of things, tend to get abused by unethical agencies that hire them out to their clients. Right. And so there are a lot of great agencies that work in the space, but there's a tremendous amount of problems. This is about $90 million a year in fees that are created through this kind of migrant economy in terms of the fees that the agencies are charging. And according to the statistic that had been calculated, around half of those, about 56%, have been charged illegal fees as a part of that placement system.
Right.
And so what DigiNex has
fees that the placement companies are charging the workers in order to find them positions, in order to possibly facilitate visas and things like that. So it begs the question: why blockchain?
Yeah, it's a very delicate position to be in. So I think it gives a lot of leverage, and what blockchain brings to that is the anti-leverage by providing lots of transparency, because the data, because of the immutability of the solution that's being put in place, thanks to the ledger technology, it really creates data, I think, management and integrity opportunities that can really just kind of remove any opportunity for these agencies to be going outside of their limits in terms of what they're allowed to be charging them. How many specific people they're actually working with and what they charge them things for. And so the idea is basically, so DigiNex together with a UN agency that focuses on migration and employment is they've put in this solution that will allow, it's not something that's being forced on agencies. What it's allowing them to do is, for the good actors, they can use this to not only learn how to work correctly within the space in terms of any specific standards that they should be applying to and any other issues that should be applied to working with migrants within these this specific situation. They can then measure their progress in terms of learning and applying what they've learned about how to work with these employees in this space. And then this provides them with a reputation to be able to say that we are an agency that treats our workers correctly. So this potentially could create a scenario where the reputation of individual agencies will push more and more of the worker community towards those agencies, which will create a harder situation for the unethical agencies to continue to exist. It's not being forced on them, so potentially, how much that will happen, we'll have to see. But this is at least a really great application of. It's actually not a very complicated concept to be doing, but by by being able to really step back and say that just, with the technology of the ledger being able to prevent any kind of manipulation of this data, we can all trust that everything is being done correctly, and that the records are unchanged, unmodified, correct. I think that's if you've been to Hong Kong and seen the sheer amount of at lunchtime, the sheer amount of workers that are kind of hanging out, having their lunch all together, because very often it's from communities like the Philippines or for Thailand. This is a really big community. A friend of mine produced a film on the undocumented workers of Hong Kong a couple of years ago. Many of them are in a very delicate and difficult situation. Most of them have left their families and their kids behind to come and make money in Hong Kong. So anything that creates a more stable situation, I think in this case, the blockchain really adding trust to the agency model. But then we move even further and talk about, can we really break the cross-border remittance systems that are in place as well, where people are being charged ridiculous amounts of money, 20, 30% potentially, to send money home to their families. There's a lot of things here to fix, and I think blockchain and crypto assets can go a long ways towards that.
Absolutely, and important to note, this isn't just in, the problem isn't just in Hong Kong. No. It's part of the 21st century population movement issue, and potentially, I'm assuming if the UN is involved, they might be looking at this as a proof of concept, and then possibly adopting it in other places. So
they're hoping that this ticks that box, and that they could, if it does, roll it out kind of globally. To be able to address this situation in other places. It's very obvious in Hong Kong that it's very affordable to have this kind of help, but unfortunately on the other side, that means they're not making a ton of money, but they're making a lot more money than they would make at home. Right. But all of that creates these spaces where people can abuse the system, and great to see if this works, and then great to see it scale out elsewhere.
All right, so we'll categorize that in the good column. We've got a bit of a downer story here. So we're hearing more and more of companies, especially in Europe, who are closing down, looking ahead to 2010 and new anti-money laundering regulations that are coming in the pipeline. So we already heard this week, BottlePay, SimpleCoin, ChopCoin, these are all companies that have already announced that they're shutting shop because they're incapable of meeting the new standards. You think we're going to be seeing more of these? What are the considerations that are going in there? And how is this going to affect things immediately in the European Union? But also, they're not the only ones with the regulations hammering down on them.
Right. So this relates to 5-AMLD, the fifth AML directive of the EU that was passed this summer and goes into effect on January 10th. I would point out one word. I don't think this is about them being incapable of applying this. I believe it's about them being unwilling, which is important distinction. Subjective. But if we look at their business models, one of these is a micropayments kind of tipping solution with BottleCoin, and then we've got with the others, you've got SimpleCoin was a mining pool platform, which I think had around 20-something thousand people in the mining pool. 42,000. And the gaming platform, which was this other one with ChopCoin, had around 305,000 users. The reality is that they've all cited that they will not impose KYC on their users. So they could very easily, in terms of this is not something that is not technologically possible or isn't really doable in their situation. It's because that ideologically they're choosing not to do that, and that's an argument that can be made across the crypto sphere. Whether how does this affect kind of the ethos of how we want to build these things and where they should go? But the reality is, the fourth AML directive that was put into place in 2017 created a lot of structure and limits on basically removing the possibility to move lots of money through crypto. So whether it's a prepaid crypto card or it's beginning to have AML in place on a level that identifies transactions from at-risk third-person countries or politically PEPs, politically and enhanced persons, political leaders and things like that, or people who are visible, being able to put in the rules to identify this. And the fifth AML directive takes those a step further now to go even further. So for example, on the prepaid cards, I think it was $250 that we had before on the prepaid card limit. Now it's 150. Anonymous transactions are limited to $50. Enhanced KYC for certain transactions. All of that kind of stuff that comes into play is obviously runs counter to what a lot of people would like to see in terms of the anonymity behind crypto. But the reality is that this puts in place limits, and whether or not they would be considered reasonable by everyone, to prevent large amounts of cash being moved either through exchanges, through platforms, or even through simple things like loading up prepaid cards or others with cash, and creating very mobile stores of value that can be used to finance all kinds of criminal activity. And I think that in some ways that's overblown. I think cash is still, we have to continue to come back to the idea that cash is right. The ultimate way to move value, especially in a way that people can't track very easily and that you potentially didn't earn legally. But that said, this is going to be in case for all these three platforms, and there will be many more to go to your other question. This is most likely in these instances, and in the majority of these cases, will be a case of not wanting to enforce this, so they're choosing to shut down. But I do think there will be certain economic models where it will be on the microtransaction level or others, it will be very potentially difficult to have, to be able to validate the identity of everybody who is going to use a particular token economy of a solution, which means they're not viable. So I think we will see some of that, particularly on the microtransaction side of this. But otherwise, I think it's just more about taking a stand and saying this isn't something that we want to support because of the philosophy behind crypto. That's unfortunate because companies like BottlePay just raised $2 million, I think this summer, and now they're closing. So that can't really make the investors terribly happy in that situation. Hopefully they will find a way to work around this and relaunch their solution in a compliant way from a jurisdiction that they're happy with. But this is, you can't go around this stuff too much, because if you want to involve the citizens or residents of the EU or the US, you still have to comply with those regulations no matter where you decide to hide your company. So we'll see where this goes.
There's a lot of, I mean, it's also boils down to individual jurisdictions and individual countries having their own regulations and having to abide by them all, essentially, especially if you're in a place like Europe. So it's adding a lot of confusion, uncertainty, a lot of bureaucracy, and I guess companies like this are choosing to opt out of that. Interesting. If you, with your familiarity of the players in the scene, is that something that others might choose as well, or have they already chosen up until now with the new regulations coming down so soon?
The issue, I think, is this is all stemming from or inspired by the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, that's producing these kind of guidelines. And so everybody is looking to these as at least inspiration for what they're doing. So whether it's Singapore or South Korea, or obviously the EU, Turkey, the US, Thailand. There's plenty of the regulatory stories that we're following right now that are being directly inspired by the FATF suggestions and guidelines. Something like this is going to have an effect, kind of, I think like the GDPR had, which is to provide a very clear practical template to apply. If the EU is putting this into place, then I think other countries and other regulations may just rubber stamp a very similar approach. So I don't think you can minimize the impact that this has. I think a lot of jurisdictions will just say, okay, well, we're just going to take 4 AMLD and 5 AMLD, and that's what we're going to apply here, and without necessarily thinking about it a whole lot more than that. So this will become this is going to become the norm, I think, in a majority of Western economies, this level of AML, thanks to the EU, and the SEC will eventually, or the US government in some other way, will apply very similar things, I think. And so this is going to continue. Plenty of projects are going to follow the same path. Again, I think that for the most part, this is from an unwillingness to submit to this kind of regulatory oversight, not so much a technical limitation.
All right, fair enough. We respect that choice too. Let's move on. A blockchain related story, and we're talking about CU Ledger. They're piloting new blockchain identity solutions with credit unions based out of the U.S. So, can you first of all break down what this cooperation is and why credit unions are an important player in this whole story?
Yeah. So this company, CU Ledger, is a credit union service organization, which is a specific statute that allows them to provide financial services to credit unions. Credit unions are basically cooperative banks in certain ways. So not everybody knows what those are because they don't have them in their specific country. In the U.S., this would be something like maybe the teachers in the school system might have their own credit union, or specific employees like the post office or a university. Or federal employees, military. These credit unions tend to be basically these banks that are focused on specific groups of people, most likely linked to the shared employment. And that cooperative applies certain, all kinds of regulatory things and creates interesting things in a lot of ways for fees and other stuff for the people who participate in that. So that said, this represents a tremendous amount of the U.S. economy. Globally, there are 260 million credit union members with around $1.7 trillion of circulating assets. I would expect an awful lot of that is in the U.S., just because I don't think that the credit union model is, I think it's heavily weighted towards the U.S. market, but still, the point being that represents a lot of people and a lot of money. And so the scammers have very clearly targeted anything that they can in banking. And this is one of those spaces where the problem that they're specifically going after is in the call centers, people calling in and asking to validate, to move money, to change PIN numbers, to reissue cards, whatever that might be. But this they're having some kind of a contact that kind of like the SIM swapping thing we've seen as well. Right. Call centers are kind of this weak point where you've got people that are following a very specific rule set in order to provide customer service. And once the scammers learn what that rule set is, they can potentially find the in-betweens to abuse that. And so what they're doing is CU Ledger has put into place a platform that creates My CUID, which is their digital credential. That basically, using two-factor authentication on your phone, like you can unlock it with your iPhone with your face, or right. Using your fingerprint on any other device, things like that. That particular two-factor can then be used through My CUID to authenticate your identity whenever you're calling in, dropping the ID part of these phone calls from 50 seconds to around 10 seconds. So it creates a big economy there, but more importantly, it also provides just a lot more security in really being sure, because sometimes when the questions that get asked, everybody has heard those questions and realizes that the amount of people that probably know the answers to your questions are out there. So there is a way to work around some of those things. That is exactly what CU Ledger is trying to fix, specifically around credit unions. This is what they're working on. They're using R3's Corda platform, and they're going to be pulling this, I guess, integrated into Corda Settler as well. But there was just about a year ago that was announced that they were working with Corda to be developing this. It's a very interesting story. It's not super potentially, it doesn't apply to a lot of people in the world outside of this specific community. But what's very interesting, kind of like the story we just talked about with the workers in Hong Kong, these are very specific use cases that will prove and that will create the opportunities to go and solve other problems in similar spaces. And I think they're a little bit optimistic about how they feel like their My CUID being done. The CEO talks about being able to use all of his, not need to do all of his passwords or all of his identities for other things. Right. I'm not quite, everybody wants to be the global digital ID. That's going to take a lot of work, and we'll see who actually pulls that off. But at least in the credit union space, I'm expecting that these guys have a pretty strong chance to take a good part of that market. So if you have a credit union account, it's a very good chance you'll be seeing My CUID in the near future as a way for you to protect that account and I think that's pretty cool to see these kind of practical applications that continue to show to people who are not necessarily super interested in crypto yet, or understanding the blockchain or its relevance. This really proves the case that these technologies can go a step further than existing technologies and provide real value. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is, and you know, it's people might be using blockchain technology without even knowing it, and I think that's as it should be. Ethan, that's
Yes.
all the time we have for this week. Thank you very much for those breakdowns. Always a pleasure giving us some of the underreported stories in the sphere and putting them in context. Fantastic. We're wishing you a happy holiday season, and we'll speak to you again next week before the year ends. For those of you at home.
See you next week.
Thanks, Ethan. For those of you at home, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more cryptocurrency and blockchain news.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.